Hi, this is Ibarionex from the Candid Frame, and today I want to talk about the idea of self-portrait, but probably not in the way that you think. One of the things that can happen when you're working out in the street is that as you're framing your composition, you discover that you're including yourself in the frame, that it's either your shadow or your reflection, and the first instinct usually is to move and exclude yourself from the composition. But I think there are some times when including yourself in the composition is sort of a good idea. Sometimes you are that telling element that I often refer to in some of these videos that you're kind of waiting for in a shot. And I chose 3 images that kind of exemplify that. Here's a shot made by Dominic Bugatti. This we don't have any XF information on this here. And this is probably a scene that I encounter a lot. I'll be walking down the street and I'll see some really interesting light and shadow. And I go, wow, I could really make something of this. Yet if I just photograph it as is, there's just not enough there. And sometimes I realize that, well, nothing is going to come around to help sort of complete the shot, but maybe I can use my own presence in order to be able to do it. And I think Dominic does that in this shot, because you have this really narrow shaft of light that's illuminating this sidewalk and this brickwork and this window along the wall. And he uses his own silhouette of him raising his camera to his eye in order to complete the shot. A lot of people will think that street photography is always just about photographing other people, but I think street photography is really as much a reflection of how you see yourself as it is how you photograph other people. And so sometimes this kind of photograph where you're making yourself the subject of your photograph is just as viable as anything else that you do on the street. Because for me, it's not just the people that you're photographing the street, the scene. And I think when you take a look at this photograph beyond, Dominic's silhouette of himself in the frame, you do get to see the street and the brickwork and the window, and you see in the upper right hand corner the reflections of the bicycle. You do get a sense of a place in this shot, even though this location could be virtually anywhere. It could be New York, it could be Los Angeles, it could be Boston, it could be Chicago. But despite the fact that we don't know specifically what street it is and what city it is, we still get a sense of place. And I really just like the gesture of the hand raising the camera to the eye and the form that completes. It's kind of like looking through a keyhole. That's what I get when I take a look at this image, because the shape of that light and the shape of his body give the impression of looking through a keyhole, looking at something sort of secretive. And I think in some respects, photography, especially street photography, is like that. It's taking a peek into a world that most people are not really paying attention to and revealing it in a really sort of interesting way. Here we have a shot by Stuart Paton. Again, no XF information here. Now here, Stuart, again, like in the previous shot, is using himself not just once, but actually twice in this shot. We have this bald figure that looks like he's about to walk up a set of steps, and he's really dramatically lit. His shape and his outline are really create a very stark contrast, and we have these wonderful graphic shapes that surround him. We have these wonderful triangles that pervade throughout the composition. And the saturated color of his face and his scalp really make the image pop, and it draws our eye directly to him. We have this wonderful triangular shape right below his chin, created by his shirt and his dark jacket, which again lead us to to the man's face and his downward gaze. We have these lines here. All of this stuff is directing us to him in this composition. But Stuart is also including himself. First, we have this dominant shadow here of him raising the camera to make the photograph here, and then we have his shadow here twice in the frame. I think that the shadow here really helps the shot, because without his presence here in this area of the frame, this area would be dominated by this white, I think it looks like it's either a light wall or glass. It's hard to say it. It's hard to say. I'm really not sure exactly what the situation here in terms of glass and walls and reflections. It's really a little confusing in some respects, but I like it nevertheless. The shadow here and these dark tones really help to serve as a nice counterpoint to this, because it seems like Stuart, like me, doesn't have much hair, or any hair at all. And so the shape of his head here and here is mimicked by the man here on the frame. And in fact, when I take a look at this, it looks like this shadow could be this person's shadow, but I don't think so. It really is. It's a really complex image, and it really challenges you, because you have to start really thinking about how each of these individual pieces sort of fits together, because we're dealing with all these varying shapes and reflections and mirrored surfaces that we're not exactly sure what is the real part and what's the reflection. But again, the inclusion of those shadows, of those silhouettes in the frame, really helped to make this shot of a man who's simply sort of walking within the frame a really sort of interesting and a fascinating image. And it's just a nice way of using the form of the photographer to become a really graphic and important element within the shot. Okay, here we have a shot by Baptiste Sibe. Here it's a little harder to discern the presence of the photographer. He's right here, seen in the center of the frame, raising the camera to their eye to make this photograph of this person who I think is on a bus or in a subway car. And this is probably one of the most common motifs for street photographers, is capturing their own reflection in the frame. When you're shooting through a window, whether it's in a restaurant or a bus, anytime there's a glass surface, you're going to see that reflection of the photographer. And it's something that's been long practiced. It's not just a modern phenomenon. Going back, 50, 60 years, you'll see this motif of the photographer catching his reflection within the frame. Lee Friedlander, for example, who's a fantastic and legendary street photographer, does this a lot. And he does it quite effectively. So it is ripe for cliche, but nevertheless, I don't think it should be avoided just because it's a cliche. And I think this shot is really sort of interesting, even without the reflection. I really like the sort of somber, moody sense that we get here, especially because the image is in black and white, but we're dealing with this very high contrast light, where we have the dark figure of the fellow here in the frame, and the way his eyes are relegated to shadow, so we really don't get any details in his eyes or even his hair. We have the mysterious figure immediately behind him and to his right, which is likely the reflection of someone that was within the car, or possibly standing behind the photographer. It's really sort of hard to say. The body of the photographer is probably the darkest tone within the frame, towards the center of the frame, which really works because it helps to guide our attention to this figure's face. Sometimes it can even mislead you to thinking that those dark tones of the photographer is part of the subject. And like the previous image, it challenges you to take a look at the image with a little more attention than you are usually when you're taking a look at any of the photographs that are submitted to the Flickr pool, where you take it and give it for a couple of seconds and you kind of move on. For me, this is a very arresting shot because it's not completely and easily readable. And that's not a bad thing. Some images are just a mess, right? I mean, it's just a bunch of distractions and they don't work well together. Well, here you have disparate elements that really aren't meant to work together, but somehow they do. That juxtaposition of the photographer's body and the head of the subject in the window are two things that in the real world aren't supposed to be related or connected to each other. But within the context of the frame, it really kind of works in a nice sort of abstract way. And the self-portrait in this case really helps to make a stronger and more interesting photograph. Well, I hope that was helpful to you. Give it a thought the next time you go out to photograph in the street. We have so many people that are submitting images. They're so good. It really is inspiring to me. So if you have not been part of the Flickr group, you can just go to Flickr on your computer and just ask to be added. It is not invitation only. I get some emails periodically from people that say they're getting notified that this is a invitation only. It's not. I'm not sure exactly what's causing the issue. I suspect that it has something to do with people who are trying to register through their phones or their tablets. But if you are having that problem, if you can just send us a message and let us know how you're trying to log in, that would be really, really helpful. But once you ask to be admitted, I'll automatically include you. I try to get to it about once or twice a week, so I may not be able to get to it immediately, but I promise you, as soon as I get to it, you will be added. And if you have not been listening to the Candid Frame podcast, well, the podcast is an interview show in which I feature conversations with some of the world's best photographers from all over the world. We're at episode 348. And our latest conversation is a photographer, Ewan Forrester, who lives up in Vancouver, Canada, who worked on a personal project documenting two people creating a trail for hikers and bikers up in British Columbia. It is a great story of someone who takes something that's really something that they're passionate about, in this case, riding their bikes out in the wilderness, and combining it with their interest in photography, and then making a project as a result of it, and it suddenly be having a life of its own and reaching an audience that he didn't completely expect. It's a great story and very inspiring to me, and hopefully it will be for you. And if you like what you're seeing here, please subscribe and spread the word. Well, thanks again for joining me, and I'll see you next time.